Hello and welcome to DD News. We have a very special guest today. NK Singh, Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, which is working to strengthen cooperative federalism and build a new India by 2022. This is his first interview as Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. Welcome, Mr. Singh, to DD News.
Thank you.
There is little public awareness, I'm sure you'll agree, about the functioning of the Finance Commission and about the powers that it derives from the Constitution, even among the educated people. Would you like to enlighten us about that?
Well, that's a very fair question, Munmun. Let me begin by saying that I share this view of yours that there is still very inadequate awareness, if I may say so, about the constitution of the 15th Finance Commission, why it exists, not only the 15th Finance Commission, what do Finance Commissions exist for? Well, the Finance Commission exists by virtue of a provision in the Constitution, what's called Article 280 of the Constitution, which enjoins upon the President at the end of every 5 years to appoint a Finance Commission consisting of a chairman and 4 other members, which will give its recommendations valid for 5 fiscal years. This is the 15th time that the President has appointed on the recommendation, of course, of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, the 15th Finance Commission, primarily to go into 3 important functions. First and foremost, that the Finance Commission is supposed to look at the entire kitty of all the revenue which is available to the centre and the states, and to put it in one basket. Then from the gross revenue, take out what is called the net divisible revenue. How is the net arrived at? Because the Controller and Auditor General certifies how much of it goes into cost of collection, and after reckoning for that, it comes to the net divisible proceeds. These net divisible proceeds now include everything, all forms of revenue. Earlier, you know, when the Finance Commission had just begun, it was just income tax. Later on got extended to excise, then it got extended to other things being included, but now it really envelops all the revenue which is available. Then that's the total net revenue which is available. This of course includes all state governments. Then it has to take a call on what proportion of that total revenue can be kept by the central government and what needs to be assigned for use by the devolution to the states. Then there is a second function. This is called what is called the vertical division, vertical between the centre and the states. The second function is that having decided how much will go to the states, which state gets how much, and what formula really does the Commission choose to adopt, which will enable a fair distribution of the resources assigned for the state governments to be distributed among and between the state governments. Then there is a third function. And this third function comes from the amendment to the Constitution subsequently, when we are also to give recommendations on how much money will go to municipalities, to local bodies, and to panchayats. And of course, there is the fifth and final function, that in addition, these are all devolutions. Namely, these come out of the total kitty which goes to really is to be assigned to the state. These come out of that. But then on top of this, the Commission is also supposed to give something called under Article 275 of the Constitution. These are all what earlier I said was under Article 280 of the Constitution. Under Article 275 of the Constitution, other than for what is called charged expenditure in the Consolidated Fund of India, we also give recommendations on what are something called the grants in aid. These grants in aid are expected to cover the revenue deficit of the states altogether taken together, and of course individually it varies from state to state.
Okay. You've given us, Mr. Singh, an exhaustive idea about, like you said, the primary functions of the Finance Commission, but is your commission fiercely independent of the government?
Oh, it's terrifically independent of the government. That is what it is supposed to be, and that is the spirit of the Constitution, because after all, don't forget that we are supposed to deal in an even-handed way the demands of the central government and the demands of the state government. And this is an independence which we fiercely, the Commission is expected to preserve and strengthen. Just to give you an example, for instance, in the miscellaneous provisions enacted at the same time as the Constitution, miscellaneous provisions relating to a special act governing the working of finance commissions, the Commission has the powers of a civil court, namely to seek the production of any document and seek the production of any witness within the territory of India to give its evidence before the Commission. This has been given so that the Commission functions basically as like a civil court, in which it balances the competing claims of the centre and the state in an appropriate and fair manner, and of course the requirements of local bodies, panchayats and municipalities, as well as to assess the minimum inescapable requirement for grants in aid by way of meeting the revenue deficit of state governments.
What you've just enumerated also finds mention in the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission, but these terms of reference have been prepared by the central government. Do you agree with all the terms of reference in that case?
Well, you know, it's not my choice to agree or disagree, because it is the Commission receives this notification issued by the President, and these, as I had mentioned earlier, those functions are the classic functions enshrined in the Constitution. Those are mandatory. The Constitution also provides that the Commission could give its recommendations or views on any other issues which may be referred to the Commission. And it is under this clause that every government really, or the President refers many other matters which are really in the public domain for the Commission's recommendations. They are broadly into two categories. The category one in the terms of reference, apart from those mandatory ones which I have mentioned in the Constitution, are relating to those matters which we are expected to take into account, like for instance the effects of the GST, the effects of the impact of the 14th Finance Commission's recommendation. Those are some of the matters which the Commission must take into account while making its recommendation. In addition, the terms of reference also says that we could consider monitorable performance criteria to reward the states which, for instance, follow various things, and they are mentioned in the
So we'll take that up, Mr. Singh, one by one. But before that, what do you think differentiates the Commission that you had from the previous ones? Because every Commission is unique in itself, considering the present-day challenges that are there in the macroeconomic scenario.
Well, I think that very quickly I would say there are four things which differentiate this Commission's work with some of the previous Commissions. First and foremost, this is the first Commission set up after the abolition of the Planning Commission. Therefore, many of the functions which were being performed by the Planning Commission, particularly from the gross budgetary support which it received in its allocations for planned expenditure, and that this also comes at a time when the distinction between planned and non-planned expenditure have for the first time been eliminated. So this is the first Commission which looks at the finances holistically, not circumscribed by the activities of the Planning Commission. So this is one important change. The second important change, this comes immediately on the heels of a far-reaching structural reform called the GST, which alters many of the features in the Constitution through a constitutional amendment, no doubt, which enables it to do so in regard to the divisible resources and revenues. And the GST really is the big elephant in the room. And this is the first time that such a far-reaching radical tax reforms which has taken place. Third and foremost, as India has become increasingly more and more integrated with the world, there is greater anxiety and there is consciousness for the country to pursue a path of macroeconomic stability in terms of its management of deficits, management of debt, management of fiscal deficit, not just of the central government, but of the state governments as well, and a credible path of what may be called macroeconomic features which contribute to the overall stability, which now in a more integrated India is central to achieving long-term sustainable growth.
Okay. If I can come in there and touch the point that you mentioned of macroeconomic stability, you recently headed the FRBM committee which made recommendations on the fiscal front. And after that, the budget has been presented. And now, like you said, the Finance Commission is also going to look into this as one of the key areas. How will the handling of your commission be different insofar as this particular issue of macroeconomic stability and fiscal consolidation is concerned compared to the handling of this issue by the FRBM committee?
So are you suggesting, therefore, that was one NK Singh heading the FRBM committee?
This is very familiar territory for you, isn't
it? Heading the Finance Commission. No, I think that the focus of the FRBM committee was primarily on the central government's fiscal deficit, and one of its core recommendations was on a credible path not only of fiscal deficit but also of using debt as an important macroeconomic anchor. If I were to relive that committee, we are quite heartened by the fact that the finance minister has in his recent budget accepted the core recommendation of the FRBM committee of a debt to GDP ratio of accepting 60% by 2022 and 2023 as the overall debt to GDP, which would be optimum for a country like India, and out of that 40% of the debt from the central government and 20% from the states, and a credible path of fiscal deficit which would enable that debt to GDP to be realized in that time frame. So I think that between that time and now, important variable which has come is that you cannot have a credible path of fiscal consolidation only involving the central government. The state governments have to become an important player if the debt to GDP has to be really achieved by 22-23, the state government's debt being 20% of debt to GDP but in that particular time frame. So I think that this is the first time that the Commission would be looking at a consolidated debt and GDP picture of both the central and the state government. It is well positioned to do so because after all one of our principal obligation is to look at also not only the finances of the central government but the finances of the state government as well.
The headline-grabbing recommendation, Mr. Singh, of the 14th Finance Commission was, broadly speaking, increasing tax devolution of states from 32% to 42%. I was reading that successive finance commissions have progressively increased that tax devolution to states. But considering the economic scenario, considering the burden that would be there on centre because of various factors, including GST, would it be possible for you, or would you have the elbow room to carry that forward? Or do you plan to do a review on that?
Well, I don't know whether I will have the elbow room, much less the headroom. But if I have any room at all, that's something which would certainly need to be considered in much greater depth. That is why we have a very onerous task before us. We are going about that task as systematically as possible. We have commissioned at least 40 important analytical research papers. We are engaging research entities of every state government to give us their input. We have called for really all stakeholders to be part of our process of consultation. We'll be visiting all the 29 states, not only to meet the government in office, but to meet all political parties, all stakeholders, and all academia. We wish to arrive at conclusions which would be fair and reasonable for enabling India's growth trajectory to go forward, and which would enable really the inescapable obligations of the central government and the state government to be fully discharged.
Let me ask you specifically, will you review 42% tax devolution to states?
Let me put the answer to you also very straightforwardly, that indeed that's one of the terms of reference. And we must respond to that terms of reference. Whether what the review will lead to, I think that would be exceedingly premature to say. But that we will have to look at it, is we are duty bound to do so, to discharge our obligation under that particular terms of reference, which is specific to the subject which you have raised.
You referred to GST earlier. GST is a reality. It's been 7 months since it was implemented. Has that made your task easier or more challenging?
More challenging, definitely, because I think that this is perhaps the most radical tax reform which you have undertaken. It is among the most radical tax reforms, even looking at international comparisons. It took years and years for other countries which went in for a GST to calibrate and to fine-tune. The fact that we have been able to reach almost a resting point is a great tribute not only to the working of the fiscal federal compact enshrined in the working of the GST Council, but also the political sagacity and leadership of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, that we have been able to reach a more or less settled point so quickly when other countries had to struggle for many, many years to come. And let me say that, of course, a radical tax reform of this kind is disruptive. It takes time for adjustments to take place. There are bound to be irritations in the process. This is understandable. But I think if we look at what other countries have gone through, we have reached almost the end point at a fairly early date.
Okay. Since we are talking from the perspective of centre's finances as well, will the fact that the centre needs to compensate states that incur losses for the first 5 years in the GST regime, and the fact that the centre is continuously increasing public investment since private investment is still sluggish across sectors, will all that weigh on you when you calculate what the tax devolution should be? Can that impact devolution of taxes to states?
Well, you know, I think that the primary thing we'd be looking at are those things which are directly in the terms of reference. And it will emanate from a deep consciousness which my Commission members have in regard to growth trajectory being increased, in faster elimination of poverty, in improving the ease of doing business, in bringing about changes in the cost and quality and effectiveness and productivity of infrastructure of both the centre and the states, in regard to other changes for the government's flagship program like the Swachh Bharat, like sanitation, like eliminating the practice of open defecation, and like, for instance, some of the other very important initiatives on using the digital platform to effectively reach India, which will really be a financial great cost saving in being able to administer public services without having to go through such a multiple tier. We will definitely look at the manner in which the speedy implementation of these initiatives, flagship initiatives of the central government, can bring about a faster rate of economic growth to really take India in the bracket of 8% plus rate of growth, which is inescapable to eliminate poverty at a faster rate and to create adequate jobs.
So what does the Commission really plan to do insofar as pushing reforms at the state level is concerned? Because I was reading the terms of reference and there it mentions that the Finance Commission may look into incentivizing those states that promote ease of doing business and labour-intensive growth, to name a few. So will that mean that the very spirit of competitive federalism will get a boost both in letter and spirit?
So, you know, I think that the central government has taken some very important initiatives in fostering a spirit of competitive federalism. The fact that they are allowing states to compete, that the Niti Aayog is ranking the state's performance each year, enabling each state to improve the overall climate of investment and to foster economic growth, are very, very positive initiatives in this regard. Indeed, I think if you look at our terms of reference, one very robust term of reference is really to look at monitorable performance criteria in respect of states on multiple parameters, one of which, of course, which you mentioned, is the ease of doing business, but also in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of carrying out the flagship programs of the central government, and bringing about some changes like the Swachh Bharat, sanitation, open defecation, and so on. So we will definitely be looking at how some of these kind of things can really be incentivized and what will be the most effective means for doing so.
Okay. The terms of reference refer to capital expenditure. Recently, many states have reduced their capital expenditure in order to be able to accommodate rising demands on the revenue side because of pay commission hikes or farm loan waivers, to name a few. What does the Commission plan to do on that front?
Well, we don't have any direct plans on that one because...
in terms of recommendations,
no,
I
yes,
meant.
But let me just say that if you look at the fine print of this year's, not only the budget, but some of the appending statements in the budget, particularly the macroeconomic framework statement, which is not very too much read, it's part of the finance minister's speech, he also lays that. It is to do away for an additional classification in terms of revenue expenditure. So basically what you will really have now is debt, you will have a fiscal deficit, and you will not have revenue expenditure as a separate entry. That revenue expenditure also has one or two other problems, that while capital expenditure is in the nature of growth multiplier, but the classification of what constitutes revenue expenditure is not often very undesirable. Like, for instance, to give you an example, expenditure incurred on schools, on hospitals, on improving the quality of the human resource development. That really, as a grant that goes to states, is classified as a revenue expenditure. But that is not necessarily undesirable expenditure, because improving health parameters and improving parameters on education really have desirable multipliers on long-term economic growth. So we will not only be looking at the revenue and capital expenditure in a mechanical way, we will be looking at the manner of classification, and we'll be looking at expenditure which really are not populist, because that, by the way, is one of the terms of reference also.
Absolutely.
To have a look at which state is pursuing an unduly populist policy or discouraging it. We will be looking at the nature and quality of expenditure and effectiveness of expenditure which contribute to long-term economic growth.
Will you also be looking at bridging the gap that exists between high-income states and low-income states, or rich states and not-so-rich states, in order to ensure that there is balanced development and reduce regional economic disparities? And that may be connected to steps to discourage populism as well.
That, by the way, is also part of our terms of reference, because it does talk in terms of a balanced regional development. But here is a conundrum. And this conundrum we'll have to face. Some of the less developed states have argued that we need extra attention to be able to come up to what would be all India averages and to join the mainstream of national economic development. Some of the faster growing states believe that really it is the trickle-down effect of our rapid economic growth which benefits not only us, but also benefits really the states which have really been left behind in the development process. But certainly fostering regional greater equality in securing regional balances would receive an important consideration of the Finance Commission, which harmonizes the overall social cohesiveness of India growing as a whole without creating disparities, inequalities, and regional imbalances.
Since we are talking about disparities, there are also disparities between various classes across sections of society. And farmers usually are the not-so-rich category. And we know that the government has a stated objective of doubling farmers' income by 2022. We also know that the Niti Aayog has tried to get states on board in order to implement, say, APMC reforms that could help make farmers more prosperous. Will the Finance Commission be also looking at encouraging states to adopt these reforms that haven't been adopted by most of them?
We'd certainly want to engage in them, because improving and multiplying farm incomes, which is one of the commitment of this government, goes beyond farm loan waivers. The farm loan waivers is by way of an immediate relief in improving his indebtedness and improving the farm incomes. But improving long-term sustainable income growth of agriculture requires a whole host of other radical changes, some of which of course is contained in the budget, the hints of that: improving the reach of the irrigation facilities, improving productivity of rice and grain, improving agricultural practices, in improving infrastructure linkages between the marketing centers and the production centers, and increasing the shelf life of products, diversifying agricultural activity away from merely growing crops into other ancillary activity like fisheries, dairy and horticulture. So really looking at the agricultural income as a whole and the measures which are designed to do that in the light of many studies which have been made. There is the Niti Aayog has come up with a study. There are other proposals which are on the table. We would need to look at the agriculture sector holistically, but certainly that sector deserves not only this Commission's high priority, it deserves the country's high priority, considering the fact that what a large percentage of people still live and derive their employment and livelihood from agriculture.
Southern states, Mr. Singh, may raise red flags, many think, on the fact that the Commission will be using 2011 census as the base for calculating expenditure requirements of states, as opposed to 1971 census that was predominantly used by the Commissions so far, including, of course, the 14th Finance Commission. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm glad you raised that issue. I'm glad you raised it, because recently I have read a spate of articles, some of them well researched, bringing out and alleging a bias of the Commission in looking at the census figures of 2011, not 1972, as a basis for reckoning and giving marks on the population criteria. Let me first of all clarify that this is not a Commission's choice. The Commission has in the notification been asked to use the figures of the census of 2011, and this is not a decision of the Commission, but a decision contained by the President as conveyed to us in the notification relating to the Commission's work. Having said this, I think that those articles which have been written overlook one other fact. That while we are supposed to look at the census figures of 2011, there is a clause which says that we will also look at states which have done a better job or a faster job or a more well-designed job in terms of population management and demographic control and looking at replacement rates of population. So rewarding better demographic management is also a terms of reference, and we would try and see how the two can be really harmonized in a manner where nobody has a sense of undue grievance.
Okay, so those states, like maybe the southern states, which have done well insofar as controlling population growth is concerned, need not worry, you are saying. But we haven't spoken much on local bodies, panchayats and municipalities so far. What does the Finance Commission plan to do when it comes to financially strengthening them and improving their performance?
Well, first and foremost, we intend to consult them very intensively. When we go to states, apart from meeting the state government in office, we will certainly be also meeting local bodies, municipalities and panchayats to hear them out on what they have. Second, I think that apart from the recommendations of the state finance commissions, and many of the states, I must say, have been somewhat laggards in appointing viable finance commissions, but more than that, in acting on their recommendations in the delegation of administrative and financial powers in the spirit in which those devolutions were made. So we intend to hear that out and intend to see how it's not only a question of giving financial resources, but whether those financial resources coupled with administrative powers and the delegation of the administrative powers, how in practice they need to be improved and need to be implemented to really have the objective fulfilled of strengthening municipalities, local bodies and panchayats in the same spirit in which the constitutional amendment 74th and 75th had taken place.
So there will be extensive consultations with the local bodies. Towards the end, Mr. Singh, what role do you see of the 15th Finance Commission in building a new India by 2022?
Well, you hope that we can act as a bulwark, place one or two more pillars in building a new India, where higher rates of economic growth can be fostered, and which can genuinely lead to fiscal federalism, and which can genuinely enhance the quality of partnership between the center and the states. Not only in an episodic sense of the term, and the GST Council, I believe, is an exceedingly viable example of that cooperation. How much more can this be strengthened, deepened and diversified? I believe that it is only a viable federal compact which guarantees not only the stability of our democratic polity, but which strengthens India's capability to become an important and a viable economic superpower.
Mr. Singh, we look forward to the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, which should be available by October 2019. Thank you so much, and all the very best to you for your future endeavours.
Thank you very much. Thanks.